Okay, so I've got my bit recorded. Go for it. So, in terms of the raison d'etre, then, what do you think NME's existence was really all about? Its raison d'etre.
Well, I think it's to agitate, educate, and organise, which is a line from a 1980s rap song by Brother D. Because it was an iconic publication. I always relate it to what I call the 6 S's. It's something that I came up with, that the NME pioneered some of the legends in music. You know, the 6 S's. So it would be Sinatra it would be the Stones, it would be the Sex Pistols, it would be the Specials, and right up to date it would be international grime artists like Stormzy. So it's what I call the 6 S's, and it was a type of gonzo journalism when I was writing for it in the 80s, right. Coming from people like Hunter S. Thompson in America, and it was taken on board by people like Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill, who were like the punk generation. The NME wanted to hire hip young gunslingers as their advert, and Parsons and Burchill came along to do that. And they were incredible journalists because they had the courage of their convictions. They fought on the streets of Lewisham against the fascists when the National Front were marching at the time. They were very involved in the Rock Against Racism movement, which was started because of musicians like Eric Clapton and David Bowie coming out with quite racist comments. I mean, Clapton was quoted as saying that Enoch Powell was right, and there were too many immigrants in our country. This is a man who got his whole living from blues music, you know, black music of black origin. And David Bowie flirted with fascism as well. So that's how Rock Against Racism was formed. That's how Parsons and Burchill came about. I mean, Tony Parsons was best man at my wedding. I was very close to him. He got me into journalism. Sadly, he's gone the other way now. He's actually a UKIP supporter. So, yeah, he's gone more right wing as he got older. Julie Burchill, I'm still in touch with. One of the greatest writers on the NME, Julie Burchill. I don't agree with her politics regarding Israel. She's very much sort of pro-Israeli government, whereas I'm more sort of pro-Israeli people and pro-Palestinian people as well. But yeah, so her views on that, as I say, we're at odds on. But at its peak, I mean, when I was writing for it in the 80s, it was about getting close to 400,000 readers, which was a huge readership for a music paper. Yes. And I know it has almost hit the 500,000 mark at times. So, yeah, I hope that's an answer of some sort.
Sure. So what I hear is that it was really confronting the almost the outrageousness of the right wing, and I say right wing, or that way. It wasn't an inclusive time, it was a very exclusive time, it was a very divisive time. So NME were coming in, and when you mentioned the successes, that actually what a range of musical genre over how many years, and it sounds like, you know, using those artists to really highlight the issues at the time, but particularly more so, it sounds like in the latter years when you really at the peak of what Britain was going through in terms of divisive culture. And you're saying, what I'm hearing is that was being able to be talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they brought politics to the agenda. I mean, as I say, the NME was going from 1952, so it's been going a hell of a long time. It's seen everything. But Rock Against Racism was the big one. Was the movement that made me a socialist, to be honest. I mean, I was just like a comprehensive kid from the London New Towns. I mean, I spent 30 years in the East End as well, and going to an event like Rock Against Racism at Victoria Park in East London when I was a teenager changed my life. You know, seeing bands like Steel Pulse from Birmingham, seeing Elvis Costello, the Clash, all these kind of people, and Tom Robinson Band, of course, coming out with things like Glad to Be Gay, which in those times, I mean, I didn't know anything about about gay rights or unions or socialism, and it all brought it all together for us. It was something we could all relate to.
Exactly. So
through music.
So you were almost getting your education up front through music far more, because these issues that otherwise were taboo or wouldn't be mentioned were now being expressed more openly. That's very powerful.
Yeah, he's very powerful. I mean, Tom Robinson, I mean, he's often criticised as being like a private school phony, you know, but to a whole generation of people like me, he brought those issues on board. He had a song called Right On Sister about feminism, Glad to Be Gay, which in those days to sing that song was quite a, you know, a brave thing to do in those days, when there was a lot of so-called queer bashing going on and a lot of homophobic behaviour. So
when did you join NME then?
Well, I joined the NME in the mid-80s and to the late 80s, and so I was like the next generation after Parsons and Birchall, and there were other sort of working class writers on the NME, like Danny Baker, who's one of the greatest writers the NME had, Robert Elms, who went on to do radio. I'm trying to think now, but I mean, I think one of the other questions you had, what was the principal agenda or the message that we wanted to get across? You got to remember, in the 80s when I joined, you know, there was the miners' strike going on. That was incredibly volatile, and I'm a miner's grandson myself. You know, my dad's from West London, but my mum was from the northeast, and she came from a long line of miners. You know, tough people. I mean, my granddad, he used to work a double shift down the mines. That's how, you know, hardly saw the light of day. So that was a really important thing for our family, and I got politicised through that, and the NME were writing about it, and I was writing about various miners' strike benefits that were going on. People like Billy Bragg were involved in that, and also the Wapping strike. I was personally involved in that, the News International thing, so I was on the picket line for that. Because there were a lot of people I know who, you know, cleaners who were sacked just for being in a union, and it was the whole Murdoch era as well. I was in a band at the time. It was weird because I was in a band called the Anti-Social Workers, who were like a punk reggae band, and they were produced by a guy called the Mad Professor, who's probably the leading reggae producer from Peckham, in the UK, from London, South London, and we basically used his dub rhythms. He produced all these very heavy Jamaican dub rhythms with all Jamaican musicians. And we were just three punks from the London overspill who used to, what they call, spit bars over the lyrics. So basically just rant over the dub rhythm. So it was a very original sound we had, you know, because it was this melting pot of pure Jamaican reggae, dub reggae, and then these we had a mixed race girl and two white guys from the London overspill, coming out with all these quite angry militant punk messages over and so we were involved in that, but other journalists on the NME were also in bands and stuff, so it's almost like this socialist nepotism. I was writing about their bands, they were writing about us. So there was a guy called Exmoor who wrote for the NME. He was in a band called the Redskins, which were like a very political pop band. And so I was writing about his stuff for the NME. He was writing about our band, reviewing our album and our live gigs. And there was another guy called Attila the Stockbroker, who's a poet, and he was we were writing about each other and helping each other. And I say, it was like a socialist nepotism. It wasn't like the old boys network.
It's the opposite.
It's the exact opposite. Yeah, it's so there was all that going on.
And how do you think that was received, Paul, by the readers, do you think?
Well, we had a really interesting postbag. I mean, a lot of the readers of the NME were, I would say, maybe degree educated. That's a bit of a generalism, but we were. I mean, I didn't go to uni myself. I just went to journalist college, but I know that the NME was regarded at the time as a bit like the Guardian of the music press. It was a broadsheet. It was a proper broadsheet format, and it had quite a deep analysis of music.
And that's what I'm wondering. You see,
and so. you know, they were quite switched on, and there was a lively postbag, but I would say predominantly the readers were, you know, left-leaning people.
Yeah.
Whereas the other music papers around at the time, there was Sounds, which was more of a sort of heavy metal punk magazine. That was more sort of what they called rockist, so more sort of heads down, no nonsense, mindless boogie. And then there was Melody Maker, which was more like the musicians paper. That was quite serious. But the NME combined fun with very strong politics. And the NME sort of, I would say in the 80s, we were the most important music paper in the country. We certainly had the biggest readership and the most influential. And we responded to Thatcherism, which was rife at the time, with socialism. So that is how we responded to it. I mean, under the editorship of Neil Spencer, who was, I can't remember the exact years he was there, but he hired me anyway. They formed Red Wedge, the big Red Wedge movement in the 80s, with people like Paul Weller, Billy Bragg, and it was a way of bringing, particularly prior to the 87 election, it was a way of bringing musicians into politics. We all know that music can't change the world, but it can change hearts and minds, and it can certainly have some influence. So in 87, I mean, we even put Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party at the time, on the front cover of the NME. And sadly, you know, we still lost the election because of the sort of rampant sort of right-wing press we had at the time. But and then towards the end of the 80s, there were the so-called hip-hop wars on the NME, which were some of us, I mean, I particularly love hip-hop and a lot of black music. So I grew up, as I say, in an inner-city area, multicultural area. And so that was second nature to me. I was DJing at 16, and I loved hip-hop, and a lot of us wanted to go in that direction. There were bands like Public Enemy and, you know, various bands coming out that we thought were more important than the sort of white indie rock music, and we wanted to push that agenda. But there were some writers who wanted to write about rock, we wanted to write about hip-hop, and when those wars really exploded over what the content should be of the NME, that's when I left, because I had offers to work on the national press, which is obviously a bit more lucrative when you're trying to you know, pay your bills and stuff, and you know, you're off. And so I worked on the Mirror and the Evening Standard, wrote about music for them. I mean, you said what freedom did I have to write my own pieces? I mean, we had total freedom. If they didn't like what we'd written, they would spike the story. Simple as that. They would actually, you know, put it on a spike. But I was told by Neil Spencer, the editor, that I should read George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, because that showed a very clear, concise way of writing, and it was the house style of the NME, that, you know, why use 10 words when one word will do? So it was very much a direct style of writing. You were talking about how do you want to represent a generation at that time. I mean, I was part of the what you call the soccer casual movement, which was like a new mod movement. I don't know if you remember, in the 80s everyone was going around with like Fila tracksuits and Pringle jumpers and all that sort of stuff, and it came from the football terraces. It was very much an underground thing. I mean, there were some bad elements within there, but it was essentially, I was very proud to be part of that, because it was fiercely working class. It was what all the kids on my estate were doing at the time. We were going into clubs with these sort of designer clothes that, you know, whatever you get them, they might have been off the back of a lorry or whatever, but someone was able to provide you with this gear, and it was almost like that old mod ethic of smart living in difficult circumstances. So even though you were poor, you didn't want to show people you were poor. Do you know what I mean? Because
I'm wondering if there was a conflict there as well, Paul, because here are you with your socialist values, and yet you've got labelled or designer labelled clothing. How did those meet? And yet what I'm hearing you saying is important to have that signature and not be shown to be not having those things, and yet where did that sit?
Well, it didn't. It sat okay with me because I'd say you can still buy that stuff cheap. I mean, it didn't mean that you were going into these designer shops and paying designer prices, because there was always people that would sell them to you in pubs and clubs and whatever. I mean, you never question where they came from, but it was a movement I was involved in because they were quite anti-establishment. You know, they were. As I say, fiercely working class. They loved a lot of black music, a lot of soul music, a lot of hip hop, a lot of reggae, and it was quite multicultural in that sense. And I was working on a pirate radio station called London Wide Radio at the time. This was one of the first, alongside Kiss, one of the first stations to play black music in the UK, and we were playing the music that they weren't playing on normal mainstream radio. You know, you'd listen to Radio 1 at the time. It was like listening to, I don't know, a bank manager talking. You know, we couldn't relate to those people. They weren't part of our culture. They didn't very rarely hear black music. I mean, you hear it now because you know, a lot of those pirate radio DJs have become Radio 1 swallowed them up. You know, we had DJs like Pete Tong, who's now a massive Ibiza DJ, you know, probably the best paid DJ in the world right now. And we had him, and as I say, he's on Radio 1 now. We had people like Westwood, who was, you know, more the hip hop side. We had the guy from Maxi Jazz from Faithless, we had him.
It's a lot.
But yeah, going back to that casual movement, so that tied in with London Wide Radio, because some of the soccer casuals were involved in pirate radio, and West Ham were my club, you know, from East London, so I used to follow West Ham, and it was a way of, I don't know, it gave you a sense of identity. Yeah, and I suppose what I brought, not that I was a particularly great writer or anything different, but I suppose in a way I was a bit of a PR's wet dream, because I was like a 19-year-old kid when I went on to the NME. I came from the London New Towns. I lived for 30 years in the East End of London, so I was fairly street smart, and I was a bit different to most of the people at the NME. A lot of the NME people, you know, had been to Oxford and Cambridge, and some had been to private school, and you know, they wore a lot of leather jackets, but they hadn't really lived the life, as it were. You know, they hadn't really had to struggle for anything, and so I had a different perspective. I think I brought a bit of a different perspective, a bit like Tony Parsons, Julie Birchall, Danny Baker. There were working class writers on there, but the majority, I mean, they're lovely people, but they didn't really understand where I was coming from. They were all writing about rock music, and I was writing about what I was seeing in the clubs around London and a more underground scene. So they regarded me as a bit of a sort of Damon Runyon character, because I wrote about people from an underclass, as it were, you know, rather than anything that was part of the establishment.
How did that feel, Paul?
It was a little bit weird walking in, because I walked in with all this soccer casual gear, like, you know, tracksuits, and they were all looking at me like I was like an alien had landed or something. You know, it was a bit strange, but I made a lot of good friends on there. So
it was the image I've got in my mind is almost like this meeting of classes that otherwise wouldn't have met. You know,
exactly.
You wouldn't have, and yet it was that publication that enabled you to meet and be able to share that space. You, regardless of what class, caste, creed you were coming from.
No, absolutely. And I think that at that time it was probably easier for working class people to get into journalism. It's not now. It's very hard for working class people to break into journalism now, because they tend to go for, as I say, you know, private school people, Oxbridge people. And there's a lot of internships as well. They like a lot of free labour. Well, I wouldn't work for nothing. I know I wanted to be paid for my work, even though it was a pittance.
But you were still respected. And you're on the payroll.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's virtually impossible, I would say, right now, for working class people to break into mainstream journalism.
And what consequences is that going to have? do you think?
Well, it means you're going to get a lopsided view of the world, aren't you? You know, you're not going to. It's going to be very much a sort of pro-establishment. You know, lots of stuff about privilege, lots of stereotypes, because sadly those people live quite an insular existence. You know, that because they go to private school, they're not mixing with people from other backgrounds, and they're not sharing cultures and not sharing identity and sharing backgrounds. Or
so you came in as quite a catalyst in their life.
What, in the NME's life? I suppose so, in my own humble little way. I'm not saying I was, you know, one of the most important writers or well-remembered writers. Probably most people have never heard of me because I was only there a few years. But I know, you know, people have got in touch with me and said, you know, I remember when you wrote about this and that. And I mean, I think you was going on to saying, what do you consider to be the main issues faced by 16 to 24-year-olds? Well, basically it's the same crap jobs, the same crap money, student fees. I mean, housing is virtually impossible now for people to buy their own house. Again, just like the 80s, there's a draconian Tory government in power, and I think also an identity crisis for a lot of kids nowadays. You know, they're probably looking around and saying, well, you know, if I'm not going to be able to afford my own house, you know, am I ever going to get my independence? You know, that's a major worry. And particularly to get paid to do something you enjoy. You know, there's lots of menial jobs out there, a lot of you know, this gig economy, as they call it. You know, a lot of jobs that are part-time and have got no protection, you've got no rights at work. Whereas me, I mean, I was lucky. I got to work for the NME, which to me was the best job in the world. You know, when I grew up with the NME, I mean, I first bought it when I was very young, in 1974. I just started secondary school, and I saw an NME on the newsagent shelf, and it had a Monty Python flexi disc on the front. And I thought, wow, because Monty Python was massive in my secondary school at the time. And I thought, oh, I'm going to buy that. And I sort of bought that and played this disc, and then started reading the paper a bit more, and then realised, wow, you know, these are quite interesting ideas they're coming out with. And so, when I started off, I had to have a dictionary by the side of me, because it was, you know, it was quite intellectual as a paper, and it helped me broaden my vocabulary and
opened your mind, didn't it?
Yeah, totally opened my mind. Yeah. I mean, I think you also wanted to say, what impact did the NME really have? Well, you know, a big impact. I mean, as I said, at its peak, it had nearly 500,000 readers. I mean, I think it helped win the election for Blair, but then they got disillusioned with Blair, you know, after the Iraq War and stuff, and they ran another front page cover about Blair. I can't remember what the headline was, something about, I think it was a line from one of the Who songs, but I can't remember, but it was basically saying, you know, would you ever trust this man again, kind of thing. But also the NME has made the headlines consistently over the years. I mean, a guy I know interviewed the Manic Street Preachers when Richie from the Manic Street Preachers actually carved, during the interview, he carved 4 real on his arm, and the blood was pouring out. This was during the interview. And that made front page headlines, because he was the guy who they thought might have jumped off the Bristol suspension bridge, because his car was still running outside, and they're still unsure about what happened to him. So that was a big landmark. Also, the other stories that made front page headlines took him to task over that, and he didn't talk to us for about 10 years. He refused to do an interview with the NME after that.
Strange.
So, yeah, and we're also making headlines now because they recently released a thing about the top 100 albums of all time, and they got criticised for that because one of the writers listed, in her top 5, she listed 4 albums from one band, the National, who were like this, you know, fairly recent band. But when you think about the whole history of music, You can't have 4 from the same band. So.
So it feels like it's lost its way a bit.
Yeah, it's lost its way a little bit. But you know what's changed, you know, in the generation, and if NME's lost its influence, I mean, it's now become a freebie. You can't buy the NME anymore.
No.
It's just given away at HMV free of charge. Lots of advertising in, you know, advertorial, paid for advertisement features. So it's become a bit like smash hits. It's now a sort of well, smaller than a tabloid. It's like smash hits, and it's dumbed down really.
Yes.
It's not got the same analysis. But having said that, I would say that what I would say is that at the last election, I know their editor did a great job with a movement called Grime for Corbyn, and it was all about the grime movement, which I don't know if your readers will be that familiar with grime, but it's basically, you know, an underground scene that mixed jungle music with sort of hip hop, I suppose, and a bit of drum and bass, and it's probably the biggest movement at the moment. It's like the new punk, as it were. It talks about issues that really matter to people at the moment, quite militant lyrics, and a lot about how people are living in the inner cities, and it took everyone by surprise. But the NME teamed up with lots of these grime artists like Stormzy and Jay Huss and a lot of these people, and they did this thing called Grime for Corbyn, and they did various songs about Corbyn. The grime artists did big interviews with Corbyn. They put lots of stuff out on social media, and encouraging youngsters to vote for Corbyn in the last election. And as I say, lots of grime fans actually voted for Corbyn, and that's why there was this massive surge to young people in the last election, and they nearly won the election for Corbyn. It was very close. As you know, we've got a minority government now, and I think it really raised politics again for young people, and I feel almost like it's like the 1980s again, that we're talking about the same issues. And you know, who knows, maybe at the next election, maybe that grime movement and the NME's influence may you know, get Labour into power. You wanted to know what I would change about journalism. Certainly more resources for investigative journalism. I don't think there's enough on that, and stronger unions, of course. You know, you need to push the message of the NUJ to make sure people are getting paid right and looked after. Investigative journalism is virtually diminished in all the papers, really, because what they're trying to do is get everyone on the cheap. They're trying to go for a small skeleton staff, get everyone office based. They haven't got the resources for people to go out and get out and dig up the stories, so they're trying to just be reliant on press releases and believe press releases without questioning those press releases. So that investigative journalism that used to find with people like Paul Foote on the Mirror or John Pilger have all vanished, really. You know, there's very few of those kind of journalists about. You said, what are the real issues now and how different are they from 30 years ago? As I said earlier, same as the 80s, but obviously worse in terms of housing and student fees. I mean, at least in the 80s, you know, someone could go to uni and get a free education, but that's not the case now. You said, what legacy did you want to leave the NME? Well, I suppose, I mean, I wrote a number of books after I left the NME. I wrote a humble little book called I'm a Journalist, Get Me Out of Here, which talked about my days on the NME and the Mirror and the Evening Standard. And I was very lucky to be part of, the most street smart era in music journalism. So there's that legacy. You know, I wrote another book called Spend It Like Beckham about the greed and vanity and corruption within football, and obviously the racism as well, and the homophobia comes to that. And then the third one was Sex, Lines and Videotape. That was about cult films and then the one I brought out last year was the Divine Comedians, which is about radical stand-up comedians, the history of radical. Yeah, slightly different too. And obviously my pirate radio stuff, I'm very proud of that, because we were pioneers. I mean, I wasn't technically a very good DJ, but I knew my music. I was very much a musical connoisseur, because, you know, my friends introduced me to, you know, some quite rare reggae music, rare soul music. I used to tour all over the country, going to record fairs, trying to buy all these rare records, and used to spend all my spare money on records, really. So we're very proud of the pirate radio days that changed radio for the better. Now we are getting a more multicultural feel on stations like 1Extra, the digital station, or even Radio 1 is a bit more multicultural than it was. Very proud of the work I did with the Anti-Social Workers, you know, our band. You know, we played with Peter Tosh, Bob Marley's partner, at the London Dominion Theatre. We've been on tour with him, Eka Mouse, another reggae legend. You know, our album was well received when it came out. It was very different to anything that was around at the time, and the sort of music you hear from people like the Streets or Jamie T, people like that, we were doing that sort of 30 years ago. I'm not saying that either of those artists heard our band, but we were probably the first one to do that kind of sound. So I'm quite proud of that, even though I'm quite embarrassed by some of the lyrics we wrote at the time. You know, it was great that we worked with a leading dub producer, and there was that melting pot of sound, which is quite unusual at the time. And
to hear it as it is now, and to hear it starting, that germination has happened, and now you're seeing the impact.
So I'm very proud of all of that. I mean, and I think the final question you said, you know, what is this generation missing out on without a radical NME? Well, I think certainly an intelligent broadsheet analysis of music journalism. There's nothing out there doing that apart from online. And to be honest, I wouldn't include myself in this category, but probably the best writers in music journalism, I think, came out of the NME in the 80s. You know, Parsons, Birchall, they were more 70s. The best writers the music journalism ever produced. You know, Parsons, Birchall, Danny Baker, Robert Elms, Stephen Wells, who sadly passed away, Attila the Stockbroker, as I mentioned. Yeah, I mean, Neil Tennant from Pet Shop Boys, he started with the NME, went to Smash Hits. Chrissy Hine from the Pretenders worked for the NME. So yeah, some very interesting people.
Very interesting.
I met along the way. I mean, the photographer that I worked with a couple of times, Anton Corbin, has gone on to be a leading film director now. He did the big Joy Division film Control, and I know you're a big New Order fan, and so he's a big Hollywood director now, and so
a lot of good came out. And it's just, do you think there's still a place for NME now?
I still think there is, because as I say, because of that influence on the last election with the Corbyn thing, even though it's in a more dumbed down way, I'm still glad that the NME is still out there, even though it's a freebie, and you know, there's a lot of corporate advertising in it. It's not the magazine it was, but it can still make a difference. And
that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, and they have the NME Awards every year. That's quite a prestigious award ceremony.
Who started it, Paul? I need to ask
the
you.
NME?
Yeah.
I think it's a guy called, you'll have to check this, but I think it's a guy called Maurice Klein. Don't quote me on that, but it's, I say 1952 it came out. And, you know, it's quite an interesting history.
Well, I really appreciate you taking this time. I've thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, it's a history lesson of modern history, really modern history, and the impact of how important writing, analysis, inclusion. You know, it fosters inclusion. It fosters discussing, being able to analyse, have both the content and the ability. Because as working class kids, you weren't encouraged to. You didn't. But here was a way, like for you. You saw it at 11, 12, you know, you bought your copy and that's it. It stayed, and it affected your life.
Yeah, absolutely. It changed my life completely.
Changed your life and your opportunities.
It did open up so many opportunities, you know. I managed to do TV work, radio work, write books, you know, achieve all my dreams really, appear in pop videos, Yeah, I achieved all my dreams. You know, if I had to say what was my bucket list at 16,
Yeah.
it would have probably been to work on the NME and do all the things I've done. You know, make an album. So if I died tomorrow, touch wood, hopefully I've done, but
Sure.
I'd feel like I've led a full life because of the NME.
Because of
I'll
NME.
genuinely say that. Yeah.
That happened at that moment, that time, and that particular time in social and political history as well. It's
Yeah.
so important.
But now I hardly write at all. I'm just DJing now. That's all I do. So.
Do you want to, well, you've written, in terms of books, anything else you got on germinating, do you think, or it's...
Not really, no. I'd say I'm semi-retired, you know, I'm going to live a quiet life on the coast, and, you know, many people will think, oh, you know, where did it all go wrong? You know, you just sort of...
But is it though?
Well, I don't think so, because I love travelling. You know, I've met my beautiful wife, Roma, who I met on a world cruise, and she was born in Kingston, Jamaica, so she's got that the reggae vibe that I love, and she's a very joyful person, and you know, we're very, very happy together, and you know, we're both from East London, and we both with the same age, and to meet people, someone like that on a cruise ship is incredible.
He's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's an incredible story, and all right, I might not be in the big London limelight anymore, but to be honest, I don't know if I really want to be. You know, I don't regard myself as a failure because I'm living a quiet life by the sea. I don't regard that. But some people would. You know, some people think, oh, you've got to be in that whole London metropolitan world, and you know, you've got to be racing around still doing interviews when you're 60, and I just don't want to do that really.
But you've done it.
Yeah.
And now actually it's extracting from, that's the way I look at it, you've done it, you can extract what you want from it, and then you can distill in a way that's right for you, in a way of living that's right for you.
Yeah.
It doesn't take it away.
No. And in my own modest little way, you know, hopefully I changed a few hearts and minds, but nothing revolutionary. But I feel I left my mark in my own little way.
You certainly have, and let's see what we can do with this.
Brilliant.
Let's see.
Really enjoyed it, Lina. Thank you.
Thank you so much.